Okay, so we are now recording. Just waiting for our attendees to arrive.
Oh my God, nobody's going to show up.
Well, then we'll have a very interesting discussion between the four of us.
And it will become cocktail hour.
I was gonna say, I would have brought some wine.
I didn't think of that.
I'm not going to tell you what's in my stadium cup.
Right, who has that?
Okay, looks like we have our first attendee here. So welcome. So we're just going to wait a few minutes and hopefully we'll have a few more people attend. And then we can get started.
I can hear the crickets from here.
I think I can smell a skunk from here. I don't know if my neighborhood, this must have been a skunk nearby. Okay, well, another thing to keep in mind is that we have a lot of the people who signed up also are aware that we're recording it. So it's possible that folks are just planning to listen to the recording or watch the recording. So,
all right, well, let's give them a show then.
Okay. Okay, so let's get started then. So for those in the audience, if you would like to ask a question, please put it into the chat. And as we go through the discussion, I'll keep an eye on the chat box and I'll let our speakers know about the questions that come in. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I will let our esteemed colleague, Jody, introduce the discussion. So we have four folks today that are here, including myself. My name is Dan Ascher, and I'm a tutor, and I've been a tutor and educator since 1988, and started my company, A+ in 1992. We specialize in one-to-one test prep, academic subject tutoring, and executive function coaching. We have two offices in Montgomery County, and we serve students and families throughout the Philadelphia area with at-home and remote instruction. Our first panelist is Jody Dobson. Jody pursued a career in education right out of college, working with kids and their families for over 30 years at four nationally respected independent schools, including SCH Academy, formerly Chestnut Hill Academy. In addition to teaching at the elementary, middle, and high school levels, Jody also served in administrative positions as Director of Mission, Director of School Placement, Head of Middle School, and English Department Head. He founded his company, Dobson Educational Services, in 1998, helping families to find schools and programs for their kids. He has a BA from Williams College and an MA from Columbia University Teachers College. Our second panelist is Ayanna Hill-Gill, affectionately known as Yanni. She's the president of ADVIS, the Association of Delaware Valley Independent Schools, representing over 130 highly acclaimed independent private schools in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. Prior to ADVIS, Yanni served as the head of school at Atlanta Girls School and Purnell School, with over 25 years of independent school experience in a variety of roles. Yanni holds a bachelor's degree in biology and chemistry from Dickinson College and a master's degree from Columbia University Teachers College as well, with an emphasis on private school leadership. Okay, and then Ben Douglas graduated from Kenyon College, where he earned a bachelor's degree in molecular biology. So we got another biology person.
Science.
After a brief stint working at a tech company, he started his boarding school career as a teacher of science and a swimming coach, advisor, and administrator at the Army and Navy Academy in Carlsbad, California. Returning to the East Coast, Ben entered the admissions world at Blue Ridge School in St. George, Virginia, and continued his boarding school journey at St. James School in Hagerstown, Maryland, as the director of enrollment management. At Episcopal High School, Ben is the senior associate director of admissions and is excited to help start the EHS swimming program. So welcome to everyone, and I will let Jody take the floor and introduce the program.
All right, thank you, Dan. It's really a pleasure to be here, especially with two such distinguished attendee or distinguished panelists to my right and left. This is really good. Okay, I'm an independent educational consultant with a practice now in Chestnut Hill, and families come to me seeking schools and programs and seeking my advice on finding the right schools for their kids. And most of these families, virtually all of them, are unfamiliar with the independent school landscape and unfamiliar with how this all works. So not only is the task helping them figure out what schools are well matched to their children, the task is also helping them navigate the whole admissions process, which can be incredibly daunting for families who are brand new to it. Visiting, interviewing, being interviewed by both family and student, essay writing, test taking, it can really be a daunting process. And for most of the families that I work with, this is a process that it's a path they've never walked before. So under the best of circumstances, even in the most normal of years, families navigating the prep school admissions landscape, it's a tough thing for them to do. Add COVID to the mix, as we did last year, having a new normal made it even more daunting and difficult. So really our topic tonight is navigating the new normal in prep school admissions. And so this is what we're doing tonight. And so I think we're just going to launch right into the topics that we have outlined for ourselves. And Dan, take that away.
Okay, so before we get started with some of the other points, you mentioned certain things that are required. So what is typically required for an application to either an independent school or a boarding school? Ayanna, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Hello? Okay.
We're still there.
Sure. I think what I'll preface it with saying is that all independent schools are through the process really looking for students who are fits for their school. So in order to be able to do that, there's generally a combination of ways to get that information to assess. So from the student side, students need to be prepared to submit an application that generally has an essay. And they vary from school to school. And again, with the intention from the school's lens is to get to know the student in the process. In addition, there's generally standardized testing. Some of the standardized testing includes essays, some of them don't. And independent schools have choices in terms of what standardized testing they decide to use. And then I think what is really key for students to know is that many times independent schools would like to visit. And that's when you really get a chance to know the student and the family, whether it's on campus this year, last year, perhaps virtually, but that's a good way to get a little bit further information about the student's personality and the fit. Often, from the school's perspective, the sending school, other independent schools would like to see a transcript, which will come with grades. Sometimes, depending on the level of the school, a transcript might be comments if there's not an official transcript. And then most importantly, teacher recommendations. Generally, schools ask for a teacher recommendation from the math or science area, as well as English. Again, the school really wants to see a well-rounded student and get a sense of, every aspect, not just the classroom, but also what their activities are, their leadership possibilities, what their passions are, what they're going to bring to the school, and most importantly, how the school can support them and help grow them further.
And maybe Ben can answer this question. We talked briefly in preparing for this about the different responsibilities. Can you just delineate the different responsibility of the student versus the parent in the process?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to realize that different people have different roles within this process. And if you look at the application process as 10 different steps that everybody has to do and manage, it's overwhelming and there's a lot going on. And it can actually prohibit families from even wanting to go through the process. And so, in talking to families over the last 15 years and working with families now as the coordinator of the Mid Atlantic Boarding School Group, we really recommend that families, tackle the application a little bit like how you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. And so, everybody has their role, and it really helps break up the process. And so, it's not unmanageable for any one person. The most important person in this process is, of course, the student. Everything that we want to see as admissions officers are about the student. And so, certainly, the student questionnaire aspect of the application is really important. That's 5, 6 questions that we want the students to share their thoughts on, and whether it's about them and their own background, things that are interesting to them, times where they've been challenged, times when they've failed. Those are all topics that are pretty commonly found in the student questionnaires. Schools are not looking for 5-paragraph essays for each of those questions. We want probably a pretty meaty paragraph, so we get to see how the student writes and how the student thinks. But it doesn't have to be overly onerous for the student. And then the student may also have to take standardized testing. And I think we'll probably touch on some of the specifics with standardized testing a little bit later, especially in the light of the pandemic and some of the changes that schools have made. But obviously that testing is important and gives us a lot of really important insight to how the students perform. It does equalize and let us know what some of their grades are on their transcript, and how those can kind of be normalized with other students in different school systems. And then the campus visit/interview is also an important aspect that the student really has to focus on. We want the student walking around campus, or watching as someone else walks around campus with a camera in the case of a virtual tour, seeing what campus looks like, what the students are doing, how they're interacting with teachers, and then of course meeting with an admissions officer and having an interview. Those are all things that the student has to focus on. Parents?
Well, let me just jump in
Oh,
here
go
and say
ahead.
something
Yeah.
about the application. Just again, from my perspective as a consultant, if I work with a family and we have narrowed it down to 3 to 5 schools, maybe that it really would be worthwhile applying to, generally that means that the family has to has to fill out 5, let's say 5 different applications for 5 different schools, and that can be a daunting process. Some schools have agreed to use common applications. Ben and Yanni both know this. The SFAT, or as it's now called, the Enrollment Management Association, has a common application form that virtually all boarding schools will agree to accept, at least in part. Is that right, Ben?
I don't know of a boarding school that doesn't accept it. There may be an exception here or there.
Right. And it's a huge break for the family to be able to do one application and then hit send, and it goes off to 5 schools. That's a huge break for the family. So, from a consultant perspective, the more schools can agree to use common application instruments, the better it's going to be for my families. Yanni, is there an ADVIS common application?
There's not an ADVIS common application. In fact, that is something that last year, it was certainly a conversation with our board as well as with our admissions group, and we're continuing that conversation. But what ADVIS does have is we have a common recommendation form. And so any of our schools that are part of our membership, which, like you said earlier, Daniel, is over 130, parents can use that common recommendation form, send it to the teacher, and say, here are the schools that, my student or child is applying to, and that can be sent to all of the schools in ADVIS. So that makes it easier for the teacher and, of course, for the family in terms of confidentiality.
And that's a huge, again, from the perspective of my families who are walking this path for the first time, and at every turn it seems like there's more to do. The
I
common
know.
application or the common really is a huge benefit for these families. And I beat the drum for this all the time. Let's understand that these families are having a hard enough time doing this. Let's make it easy for them if we
That's
possibly
right. Streamline. Yep.
can.
Absolutely. And in a lot of the work for overseeing the process and managing everything does fall to the parents. Even highly engaged seventh and eighth grade boys and girls, can sometimes falter with this, and it can be hard, going to a school and really asking for transcripts. And so sometimes parents really do have to take the lead in managing the whole process. There are generally, at least for most of the boarding school applications, there is a parent questionnaire as well, where, again, 5 or 6 questions. It doesn't have to be a recreation of War and Peace as you're writing the answers, but we want to hear about the student from the parent's point of view. The parents' hopes and dreams for the process, what they'd like to see the student get out of their independent school experience, students' strengths, students' weaknesses, what they're like to live with in the case of a boarding school, because we'll be living with the students, we'd like to know. So things like that from the parents, but then it's really just managing the process and acting as a chauffeur and a gentle guide for their students, asking them what they thought, encouraging reflection, maybe some journal writing after school visits, things like that. And then the last section is really the sending school's responsibility, again, being managed by the parent and or student. And those would be the teacher recommendations and the transcripts. And that's really not work that the student and parents can do. They just have to make sure that the sending school is staying on top of it and meeting school deadlines.
Is there anything that you would like to say about the difference between the boarding school application that hasn't already been said, between that and the independent schools in general?
It's a great question. I've only ever worked at boarding schools, so I'm not entirely sure what a day school application asks for and entails. I do know that the vast majority of boarding school applications are all relatively similar, and even in the essay questions that they're asking students and parents to write, there's some mild deviation from school to school, but in some of my previous schools, I've absolutely accepted applications, non-common applications that were filled out for one school, and the parent was like, "Do I really have to do this all over again?" And the answer for me at those other schools was, "No, just send me what you've already done. We all ask the same questions, and just email it on over to us, and your application is going to be done in an instant."
Yeah, I can speak to the question, Dan, about is there a big difference between that process for a day school as opposed to a process for a boarding school? The answer is fundamentally no. I mean, the independent day schools, the application and admissions process is virtually the same. It has the same major pieces: the visit and the interview, the application materials, including an essay, the testing, teacher recommendations. All the pieces are virtually the same.
Just no sleepover for
Sorry?
the boarding school? You don't have to sleep over at the boarding school?
Not every boarding school does an overnight shadow experience. That is, some definitely do, and that's important to know. And I would say for any of these applications, for this whole process in general, families should be applying to anywhere from, I would say, 4 to 10 schools, and rarely more or less than that. And with that list of schools narrowed down to that number, you can really manage the process and call the admissions offices and ask what's available, whether it's just a tour of campus or if it's a shadow day, an overnight experience. There are a lot of different things that boarding schools do, and some of that is depending on school culture. Some of it depends on um, you know, just logistics and student safety, and there are a lot of things that, especially with an overnight visit, that
Mhm.
schools really have to be careful about. But some boarding schools definitely do it.
Okay. Um, Before we get to, I want to talk about the timeline, but maybe before we do that, it's a good place to talk about how things have differed with COVID. I would imagine in terms of some of these things that you mentioned with the shadow day and
Yeah.
the overnight stay and that kind of thing. So, Yanni, would you
Danny,
like to start?
I was just going to say that regarding the shadow day, because or shadow days or revisit days, I do feel like that's a great way for families to get another peek in. And if you're a student and you're doing a shadow day, I mean, this is, the process is very important for both all parties, not just the school, but for the families and the student to get a sense of, the school. And again, is this the fit? And a lot of times shadow days are a way to do that, because you get a chance to be with one student or in a class, and it's very organic. In terms of the differences with COVID, not all schools are able to do that, right? Because they are faced with the challenges of contact tracing, and limitations in terms of sizes and classes, etc. But that's not the case for everybody. There are still schools that are doing shadow days. They might be truncated or look a little differently, and that's okay. It still allows the student to get that experience. So it's a case by case, or at least for the schools in ADVIS, it certainly is a situation where you can call, like you mentioned, Ben, and get a sense of what's the best way to get a glimpse into the school day, and go from there.
Something else that last year in the, well, I guess probably over the summer of 2020, as the pandemic was really ramping up, and we were having our hopes that the pandemic would be over by the fall. Those hopes were being dashed against the rocks of reality. We it got to be June and early August, and we realized, oh my gosh, we're going to have to do this whole thing virtually,
All
and
overhead,
we
yeah.
had to reinvent the wheel. And schools, to a certain degree, overcompensated, and we had so many virtual events, just ad nauseum, all over. I mean, it was insane how many each individual school had. And we've heard from families that went through that process that it was so stressful, anxiety inducing, always
Mhm.
feeling like you had to be jumping on a Zoom call or a WebEx call to show interest into a boarding school, so that the school would know that you were serious about your application. um, and I don't think the boarding schools realized initially that families were feeling that way. And so, now that things have normalized a little bit, or we've become more adjusted to living within a pandemic, I think schools have started to scale back. We've opened
Mhm.
up a little bit more, and we have more in-person offerings
Yeah.
generally. But I think it is really important for families and students to understand that you don't have to go to everything. We are putting as much as we are online and virtually for students and families to give them the opportunity to learn about our school. It's not something that we are thinking as a required math class where you have to go and you have to be in attendance. These information sessions and student panels and faculty panels and things like that, we're doing to try and help families, not to make them feel more anxious.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear you talking about that, Ben, because I had several parents that I was working with say, "Oh my God, do we really have to show up for every information session at every school we're applying for? Well, there's not enough time in the week for that."
Yeah, that'd be a full-time job.
Yeah, that's right.
And clearly, that's one example. of how all of you in schools had to do an incredible amount of adjusting and readjusting again as the whole COVID situation unfolded. From,
Yeah.
again, from my perspective as a consultant, I was in admiration of how boarding schools in particular were able to navigate everything they needed to navigate, student safety being primary, and within that context, being able to figure out how to do everything else they needed to do, visits and interviews and applications and testing and all the rest, at the same time trying to keep their student body safe.
Safe, yeah.
It was truly extraordinary, and it was evolving in front of our eyes all year and even into this year.
Well, we've been making it up as we go. A lot like every other industry that's
Yeah.
out there. We're not unique in having to be flexible and creative with our process. And I think one of the some of those challenges for schools and for families remain this year, in the sense that now that things have normalized a little bit, and we're in the at least the 5 schools in the Mid Atlantic boarding school group are all having um, families come to campus for campus visits and/or interviews. But we're also having virtual events for families that either don't feel comfortable flying across the country, or they're unable to, or the logistics are too difficult. We're now faced with having to do our job almost twice.
Mm.
Um, having it one real time, and then secondly virtually, trying to help all families with the search process and the understanding and the research phase of things. So it's one of the challenges that we're facing. I do think it's important to say, and again, this is definitely a little bit more boarding focused. But boarding schools aren't placing greater preference on in-person interviews or in-person campus visits over virtual interviews or virtual visits. As it works in a file, and we're reading interview notes, there's no designation whether it's virtual or in person in terms of points gained or anything like that. They're not graded differently. They're not read differently.
Yeah.
So the virtual folks aren't at a disadvantage, other than the fact that they don't get to, smell the campus air and feel the green grass of the quad under their feet and things like that.
Yeah.
You think that's going to become a permanent thing?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, the virtual interviews and virtual visits, I do. It's something, honestly, the virtual interviews anyway are things that boarding schools have been doing for a decade plus. With our international students, a lot of the time we were interviewing, by this ancient technology called Skype,
Right.
and so I mean, even before the pandemic, I was probably doing 25 interviews a year with international students, virtually anyway.
Right. Yanni, what's going on with the day schools? Are almost all interviews and visits being done live?
It's a mix. It's a mixed bag. When we do some polling with our membership and we have our roundtable discussions, most of the schools are really trying to do a combination of approaches. So for our open houses, many of them are in person or all in person, and when they are, they generally have been outside. And I think that has worked, and that has given folks different ways to look at doing an open house. Then we have some schools that are doing mostly in person and some virtual, and then vice versa, where they're doing mostly virtual and some in person. And I think all of the schools, I shouldn't say all, most of the schools have said that their timetable for applications really hasn't shifted. So they're still trying to accomplish the same that they would do prior to COVID in the same time frame. So I think having multiple approaches, whether it be in person or virtual, is actually a good thing for them to obtain the information about the students and the families and vice versa, and still be within the same timetable.
And I'd ask a question in that regard, and this is for both the boarding and the day population. There's traditionally been the application calendar. Get everything in by January
Mhm.
1, and then schools make their decision by whatever it is, and then the family has to make their decision by March 1st or April 1st. And I know there's always been some flexibility around that. What is your impression now of how schools are adhering to that traditional timetable?
I
Ben,
mean,
boarding
first
schools, are you still adhering to that traditional timetable for the most part?
yeah. So from the boarding perspective, absolutely. I do think that schools, like you said, they've always been somewhat flexible with those deadlines. I think probably the more applications a school receives, the less flexible they are, just because they don't have to be. But schools are. I mean, we're kind and friendly places. We love working with students. We're not going to disregard a student's application just because a sending school teacher gets their math recommendation in 48 hours after the deadline. Educators just have hearts that are too big for that, so that's not going to happen. And so basically the same thing's happening within the context of the pandemic. Deadlines stayed the same, notification dates stayed the same. Maybe there was a little bit more flexibility for some schools on the time when the family had to notify the school of their
Right.
decision. Schools could be a little bit more flexible there, but again, that depends on the school itself and their selectivity and where they are in the hierarchy of schools.
Yeah, and Ben, I would say the same thing for the day schools, where the flexibility is really on the family's notification date to the school. But I will say the frame. I just want to put some context around why we have timetables. I mean, a lot of things are happening in that time frame. Been preparing for the following year from a school's perspective. Budgets are being made. You have to get faculty and teacher contracts out. A lot of things are happening based on enrollment. So the timetables aren't arbitrary, right? It's not like, oh, we just want to pick this date. It's really because we're trying to plan for the following year. And that hasn't shifted because of COVID. We still have to plan for the following year. So I think schools are feeling a little bit more of the tension and stress of that because they're trying to keep up with the applications, doing two different modes of virtual and or in person, and still having to adhere to similar timetables to make the best decisions for the good of the school and the families.
And honestly, if anything, the pandemic had, very generally painting with a very broad brush, the school, every school I've talked to saw an increase in
Yep.
application.
Yep.
And so, it's not like we had less work to do, so we could
Correct.
shorten, like we could, give families more time to get things in. We actually had more work to do.
Let's
Agreed.
talk about let's talk about trends a little bit since you brought that up. What did you notice about application and enrollment trends during COVID and the year after COVID? What did you notice from the boarding school perspective and the day school perspective?
Yeah. So again, applications were up. We the way the process unfolded for a lot of us in the boarding school world last year was that families started the process much later than they usually do. Applications usually become live in September. And September's a little bit of a slow month, but by the time we hit October, you know, we have families on campus, applications coming in, inquiries coming in, and we're going and working pretty hard, moving pretty quickly all the way through the middle of January during that process. Last year, it was the middle of October, and boarding schools were calling each other, and we were like, "Oh my gosh, we're 20% down, we're 30% down. What's happening?" Um, and folks were worried, and this was before we knew what was going to happen. And then when families made that decision that the pandemic was here to stay, and that virtual learning, maybe in public schools or
Yes.
whatever, wasn't working well for their children, it was a tidal wave of interest that crashed on us in November, December, and January. And again, all of our numbers were up. It was just more highly concentrated in those 3 months.
Mhm.
Day schools as well, Yanni?
I think so. I think it's very similar. We certainly saw an uptick in applications and in enrollment across the board. And I think the biggest question for both boarding and day schools were, retaining those students, especially those students that had come in later in the process and really were public school families. Were the schools going to be able to retain those students beyond last year? And from our perspective, and with our schools, they've been able to do that. And I think that was intentional. Once we saw those, uptick, right away, retention committees, started forming. And all right, how do we make sure that we can maintain these students and retain these families that we want to retain? And I think independent schools proved themselves in terms of being able to deliver a great education, whether it be virtual or hybrid, in a crisis like the pandemic.
So the trend in terms of retention, what I'm hearing you both say is that, first of all, the application trend, it just exploded in mid-year when people realized that this isn't going to go away anytime soon, or virtual learning at home is just not working from a public
Right.
school perspective. Well, what about the trend with re-enrollments? Families that came in, are they staying for the most part?
They did this last year,
Right.
and it's the business and the admissions world seems to be year to year, and there's always uncertainty, and you're almost always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, and when is that change going to happen? And we were, we didn't see any attrition in June, and we were like, okay, well, it's going to happen in July, and it didn't happen in July, and so we were like, okay, August is going to be, and it didn't happen in August, and school started, and everyone's moving and grooving and busy with school, and so
So the so-called summer melt didn't happen as much this year.
no, and I mean, it happened a little bit here and there, but it was significantly less than in other years. For at least, again, for the MAB schools that I work with as their director, but then also some of the other boarding schools in the region that we stay in touch with, and make sure that we're in alignment with.
Day schools, same trend, Yanni?
Yeah, similar, as I was mentioning, that was, the worry about the uptick, and I think all the schools really did a great job at creating retention committees early on, and figuring out strategies to retain those families. So we really did not see much attrition from last year to this year.
Well,
Do you attribute part of that to the fact that people were still uncertain of where the COVID pandemic is going to go?
I do think there's a piece of that. I mean, I think people were thinking it'd be done and over with last year, and as we all know, that wasn't the case. And I think many of our schools were able to prove that we could, really pivot pretty quickly, or really had sort of that nimble and agility to be able to meet the needs. And so parents felt like, well, it's here, COVID's here, so we're gonna stick with the school. I do think
How
that was part of it.
how has the COVID situation affected financial aid at boarding schools and day schools?
Mm,
That's a good question.
great question. I mean, I could talk a little bit about early on. I'm not sure for
Yes,
this year,
right.
but I think many of us in independent schools were worried initially 2020. What is this going to mean, for folks and for maintaining our families then, right? Because people were potentially going to lose their jobs. What was sort of going to be the fallout? Many schools created, really crisis or COVID. Committees around that and how we're going to maintain in our current families. And some of us had emergency funding. Some schools did actual fundraising to help with that. Some schools dipped into their endowments a little bit more to make sure that they had the funds to retain the families. Some of them did very short-term financial aid. This is yours for the next 6 months, next year, whatever it was going to take. I think at that point in 2020, we were all just wanting to keep our families and do the best that we could by them, knowing that their situations were uncertain as well. I'm not sure how that has flown into this year. Maybe you know a little bit more, Ben, being out of school, but I'm not sure how that, if there's been, an increase in financial aid need as a result of COVID.
It's really, really school specific,
Okay.
and it. I think it probably affected the the kind of the nature of financial aid, probably the extremes in boarding schools. Really, in the financial aid world, there's a lot of talk about the barbell, where you have families at the school that are very affluent on one end and are high income families, and then families that are low income families that are high need and receiving a lot of financial aid. And it's the middle that's actually a little bit underrepresented at schools, at least at boarding schools, where our tuitions tend to be a little higher. And I think the pandemic kind of accentuated those differences, and that schools that have really robust applicant pools, and there are lots of full pay families within their applicant pools, I think they were probably a little bit better insulated from a financial aid point of view than other schools that maybe have more financial need within their applicant pools. But at the end of the day, though, the schools, again, like, we're educators first, kind of almost wrapped in the wolf's clothing of a business.
That's right. Love that.
And so we're going to help families, and if it's a current family that's falling on hard times, because of the pandemic or for other reasons, schools do everything they absolutely can to keep those families, so that the decision isn't because of finances.
Right. And Jody, this isn't an answer to the financial aid question, but it is an answer in terms of making that adjustment. I know certain schools did different payment structures, right? So that folks could, sort of figure out how they were going to meet that current tuition and finish paying off of that. And generally that's done, throughout a normal year, but I think many schools made exceptions.
Good to hear.
One other question that's related. Oh, go ahead, Jody.
No, I just paying attention to the clock here, and I know something that's on your mind, Dan, as a test prep organization, and that's been on my mind as a consultant. And we chatted a little bit about this, and that COVID really affected the whole question of standardized testing and how dependent schools were going to be on standardized testing as compared to the past. How to get the standardized testing was a huge difficulty during COVID. I'm an SSAT test center, independent test center, and compared to the usual, 15 or 20 kids that I see in my office for SSAT testing, this past year I had 2, because first of all, testing was so difficult to get. No longer was it possible to go sit in a sweaty room with 30 other kids taking a test. That wasn't going to happen. And then when the Enrollment Management Association, or SSAT, tried to do online testing, it kind of was a disaster. So that really affected schools' thoughts about standardized testing. So Ben, maybe you could speak a little bit about that from the prep school perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think last year schools, relatively quickly, but also at their own individual paces, made that decision to go test optional last year. And then this year, it overall across the entire boarding school marketplace, it's going to vary from school to school and depend on that school's process and their philosophy and things like that. I know certainly the 5 MAB schools, which are Blair, Petty, Mercersburg, St. Andrews in Delaware, and Episcopal High School, we've all decided to be test optional for this year, and then reevaluating things for next year. So it's right now for us, we're test optional, and we've taken it all completely out of our scoring matrix for the candidates as we're reading their files. So a student that does really, really well and submits their score is not going to be at an advantage over someone who either takes it and doesn't do well and doesn't submit their score, or that just decides not to take it at all. For our 5 schools, it doesn't have an effect.
And I will say that reflects a trend nationwide, not just the MAB schools, but others as well. With the possible exception of the most competitive schools that in New England. But even they were much more flexible about testing than was in the past. How about day schools, Yanni?
It's very similar. It is all over. and it's specific to each school. But I do think the trend of schools that sort of did it last year are continuing to do that this year, because I think what they found is they were able to gain similar information in different ways. And those students that came in this year are great fits. So then it starts really begging the question of what's the role of testing in the admissions process. And I think that's a bigger question. And I think many of us have, started that conversation years ago. And I think last year proved it was like, okay, well, perhaps we might need to look at something differently or really think about why we're doing testing, as a part of the admissions process. And if so, what kind of testing makes the most sense? Because I think we were able to really obtain information about students in very thoughtful and creative ways.
And it will be interesting, Ben, as you were saying, to see what the trends are. Since you admitted and are still admitting a whole cohort of kids test optional, tracking their success over the
That's
years
good.
is going to be an important thing to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in just like Yanni said, we think we did a great job in finding that same information. We don't know for sure yet.
Right, that's true.
We've had some progress reports come out and
Right.
things look pretty good so far. But until you see the semester grades and end of the year grades
Right.
of the students' first year and then their GPAs again when they graduate, we're not going to know for sure how effective those other avenues and those other methods were.
It's a big research project at the moment.
That's right.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So
How are we doing with our topics, Dan? Have we touched everything that we needed to touch?
there are a few other things, but before we do that, I just want to ask if it's a test optional environment. How does the family determine whether they want to provide the testing?
Honestly, it's really up to them. And like I said before, submitting a test score is not going to help or hurt a student's candidate score. I would say, just thinking about my own kids and if they were applying to boarding school and
You lost
Jody
Jody.
didn't like my answer.
Jody, where'd you go, Jody?
I'm coming back.
Okay.
Okay.
But thinking about my own kids, if there was a weird or unusual transcript in the sense where a student had a little bit of a bump in the road, say in math, and they took the SSAT and they had a great math SSAT score, like sometimes you can use that SSAT data or other tests. It doesn't have to be SSAT necessarily, to help explain and to help maybe put some concerns of the admissions office and the admissions committee at ease with those tests. And how should a parent find that out? Honestly, I would just ask your admissions officer. Most admissions offices are going to have the person who interviewed the student and worked with the family during the visit be their primary point of contact. And we are super transparent. We want families to, do the best that they can with the process, and we want to get the most and best information from families. And so if they say, hey, here's his SSAT score and his math sub score, here's his transcript. Is this going to help you understand what's on this transcript? And if the answer is yes, I'll tell the family yes. Please send it in. We want to know that. We want to make good decisions.
Yanni, what's your opinion? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yanni, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's spot on. I think that is what most admissions departments would say, both in independent schools and the college level, quite frankly.
Absolutely right. What I was going to kick in with is that some kids who come into the admissions pipeline through either day or boarding schools may have had the occasion to have an individual set of testing, an individual psychoeducational test.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, is that readily accepted in lieu of admissions testing at either a day school or a boarding school?
Well, gosh, in a normal year, it would not be accepted in lieu of testing.
Right.
If there is psychoeducational testing of any kind, most boarding schools will have some kind of a box that you need to check that says, has your child ever been tested by a professional? And if that's a yes, we would like a copy of it just so that we know what's in there and what accommodations exist. We're not guaranteeing that we can meet those accommodations, but we want school and family to move into a relationship, with eyes wide open, and so that we know what's best for the student.
Day schools as well.
Yeah, I haven't heard in lieu of any testing, but it's really supplemental. And again, it's and some schools require it after admission, so you can get a sense of whether or not you're going to be able to meet the needs of the student, and what support and what modifications or accommodations that student might need.
So you're saying that would be a conversation after the student is accepted, and
Not
then
all the time, it depends on the school, but I'm saying it's not certainly in lieu of
right,
standardized testing.
yeah.
It's usually supplemental in addition to.
And Dan, I would say if families have it ahead of time, they should give it to the schools ahead of time, so that if there are student needs, to allow them to be successful, schools need to know about that, because not every school has the resources or the academic profile to help every student. And so, it may be that, and sometimes, and not that there are rankings, but like a school that's perceived as, maybe a lower ranked school that doesn't have a certain program, but there's a school that a higher ranked school, quote unquote, that does have a learning needs program. They might be able to be more flexible with the profile of a candidate.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would. Parents often ask me, parents of kids who've had full psychoeducational testing for whatever reason. They often ask me, well, should I submit that to the schools that we're applying to? And my answer, almost always, rare exceptions, is full disclosure is the best. The more these schools know about your child, the better they're going to be able to decide whether they're a good match for your child and whether they can provide what your child needs. So I'm always an advocate with the parents who ask me that for full disclosure.
Okay, we have a question. As a psychologist who provides testing for private school admissions, do you have any suggestions for how I can ensure the assessment provides relevant information in this new testing optional framework? Who would like to take that question?
Sounds like Jody to me.
Yeah, that's a great question, and because I'm not in the admissions field, I can't speak to that specifically.
Jody, what do you recommend with clients that need psych ed testing?
Well, it can come from a variety of perspectives. Like a child is struggling in school, one of the first steps that I always recommend is, well, let's find out why. Let's find out what's going on here. So let's send them to a good school psychologist, a good educational or psychologist or neuropsychologist, and let's find out what the learning curve, what the learning pattern is, and where the vulnerabilities are, and what the recommendations are for support. Let's get a full, detailed roadmap for where this child is and what this child needs. So that's usually the reason for it. And I would say that my observation as a consultant over the years I've been doing this is that if there's a trend for academic support at boarding schools nationwide, the trend is up. More schools are providing more services for kids than used to be the case. More kids are recognizing that these kids learn differently and that they may need accommodations and supports that they hadn't thought that they might be able to provide in the years past, but now they're going to provide it. And I would say the same thing for counseling support, which is sort of parenthetical. So many more boarding schools now have psychologists and counselors on staff, on campus, to provide not just learning support, but also counseling support. Much more than was the case 10 years ago, let alone 20.
Are you seeing that that's helpful? Is it making a difference for kids? Having that support?
Yeah, I absolutely would say so. I think, kids are so So they were, gosh, they were anxious before the pandemic and before they were, locked inside their house or apartment with their family for 18 months. And it's, only increased since then. And so I think boarding schools, are just continuing to serve the needs of the students in any way that they can. And it's absolutely very helpful.
And even the very competitive day schools, which I worked in for a while in this area and elsewhere, schools that used to say, no, we don't take kids like that, are now recognizing that, yes, you do, and you better figure out ways to support them because they're on your campuses right now.
Right.
Yeah, they're on your campus whether they're diagnosed or not, and I think
Right.
that's a whole side conversation about pedagogy and and education in itself. But
Exactly.
And it sounds like you have to help parents understand that it's really important for them to be transparent about it, so it's gonna be the right fit and the student's gonna get what they need.
Yes, so.
it's always about that. Yep.
Yep, absolutely. It goes back to what Jody said at the very beginning that, we're all working to help families and students find their best fit schools, and not, the school that's highest ranked on some, mythical ranking website that's out there. It doesn't exist for boarding schools. It doesn't exist for day schools. There's no such thing as the best school.
Thank goodness.
Only the
Yes.
best, exactly. Only the best school for your child.
Right, yeah. So we're
Well,
almost out
I
of
know
time here.
we're just about out of time. Is there anything else we need to touch on, or any question in the chat that hasn't been addressed?
I was just gonna say if there's any last words that, you guys would like to add, if anything that you think would be helpful for people to know before we finish up?
All right, Ben Douglas, you're up.
Oh my gosh. Thanks for
I
making
do,
me.
I have a question, so if you don't have anything else to say.
Got a question?
Well, the question is basically, what's happening with international students?
Um,
What's the trend there? So
uh, International students within the schools that are part of MABS, and then some of the schools that are on the periphery as well. We've seen applications go up, even though students were unable to visit. And certainly last year was really hard for a lot of our international students
Right.
that were living and studying remotely and virtually with different time zone effects, and it was a really challenging year for our international students. But we continued to see strong interest, from all over the world. Certainly from Asia and Southeast Asia were hot markets and continue to be. But still, European countries and African countries and South American countries are absolutely still sending students to the U.S. for boarding schools.
and for, what about the day schools?
I'm not sure if there's been any shifts. I know there were, like you said, issues with visits and some countries with visas, and just getting students back that you already had on campus that were international students. But I think for this year, that is pretty much shifted. I think folks that were at least already students are back. I know when I was ahead last year, part of our challenge was making sure that students who were coming from certain countries, especially if we had a virtual program, that we were communicating with the appropriate folks in the countries about any change of curriculum. So that I think that's the case for most international programs.
There were actually some international consultants that got pretty creative, within the pandemic, and they had kind of study groups in
Mhm.
various cities where students from all kinds of different boarding schools would come to one
That's great.
location to study together and still have
Yeah.
some of that social interaction that was really lacking.
It sounds like this year it's more or less back to students being able to come back on campus.
Yeah.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
I think that's true for everybody, like, for international and domestic students. I think we saw that last year, and I think this year, and sort of this is my closing thoughts about this. Many schools felt like they accomplished great things last year, and we kind of knew what to do, right? So that allowed us to have even more creativity for this year as we had to plan, with the Delta variant, and sort of knowing what we could do as a school. So I think every independent school all opened up with folks on campus with that intention of, safety, making sure students were going to be safe, but that we were going to be able to really have in-person instruction, and provide what we know is best in terms of, an independent school education, which is personalization, building that community and really feeling like, we have a community.
Might be a good place to wind up, Dan.
Mhm. Well, thank you guys. This has been a really great discussion. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure it's going to be very informative for those who couldn't attend tonight and are going to be watching the recording. I will be sending out an email to all of our attendees and those who are registered but couldn't make it, and I will include the contact information for our panelists in case folks want to ask you questions directly. So thank you so much for your time, and
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank
Yanni.
you.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
Thank you,
okay,
Dan, Jody, Yanni. Great job. Thank you.
Yep. You as well.
yes,
Take care, everyone.
excellent. Okay, bye bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.